In a climate-controlled room on the second floor of a small New England historical society, there is a sheet of paper that almost nobody asked for, and almost nobody, at first, knew what to do with. It is the size of a school notebook page, its edges browned and slightly brittle. The paper is held flat in a polyester archival sleeve, the kind that glints a little under museum lights. On the page, in wavering lines of crayon and ink, a child has drawn another child's body. The figure lies flat, arms by its sides. From just below the throat down to the lower belly, the torso is opened with a single vertical cut. Ribs are roughly suggested, not quite even, like pickets of a fence. Inside the cavity, in simple shapes, are sketched the organs. A heart like a turned strawberry, two lumpy shapes for lungs, a dark mass where a liver ought to be, a looping tangle for intestines. Each is labeled in crooked letters: heart, lungs, liver, guts. Low on the right side, next to the drawn intestines, the boy's hand has added a small worm-shaped piece of tissue. It is circled and singled out with 3 short lines, as if it deserves special attention. Next to it, in phonetic spelling, he has written, "Appendix, bad piece." At the bottom of the page, under the drawn feet, is a caption, "Annie, after." The words are pressed hard, as if the point of the pen almost tore the paper. In the upper right-hand corner, in the same brown-black ink, is the date, March 3, 1881. The drawing is part of what archivists refer to as the Reed family papers, a collection of letters, receipts, a family Bible, and a single child sketchbook given to the Hampshire County Historical Society in Massachusetts in the mid-1950s. For decades, that sketchbook sat in a gray archival box on a back shelf, described in the catalog only as Notebook with Children's Drawings, 1880s. Folded with the page now, in a separate sleeve, is an official death record. It is a printed Massachusetts death certificate from 1881, filled in by hand in neat clerk script. The name on the certificate is Anna M. Reed. Under age, someone has written 9 years. Under place of death, Millfield, Massachusetts. Under cause of death, ruptured appendix, peritonitis. The date of death on that certificate is March 6, 1881, 3 days after the date written on the drawing, and 4 days before any autopsy was actually performed. In a different folder, from a different part of the same archive, there is a third document. It is a copy of a county coroner's report from March 1881, part of the file from a routine inquest. The report describes, in unsentimental language, what was found during an autopsy on the body of 9-year-old Anna Reed. It notes a midline incision from just below the sternum to the pubic bone. It notes that the abdominal cavity contained a quantity of cloudy fluid. It notes that the small finger-like appendix on the right side was inflamed and perforated near its tip. The attending surgeon, a Dr. Josiah Cole, is quoted as referring to it as the bad piece that had already poisoned her. The marks on the boy's drawing, the circling of that small shape, the words appendix, bad piece, mirror those notes with unsettling closeness. The boy who made them, Thomas Reed, was 12 years old in 1881. He lived in the same house as his 9-year-old sister, Annie. He had no medical training, no schooling in anatomy beyond the simple diagrams in his copybooks.
By all accounts, he should not have known where an appendix was, what it looked like, or how it could kill. And yet his drawing appears to show her cut open on a table, with attention paid exactly to the small, lethal organ that the adults around him were only just beginning to understand. So, the questions rise almost on their own. How could a 12-year-old boy in 1881 apparently draw his younger sister's autopsy, incision, organs, and cause of death 3 days before she died, and 4 days before any autopsy was actually performed? Is the date on the page wrong? Added later, perhaps, when memory was already blurring? Was the drawing misattributed in the family papers? Was the death record copied incorrectly? The inquest file misdated? Or did Thomas see or sense something that the adults around him were refusing to say out loud? The story that follows is not going to be a ghost story, at least in the simple sense. It is also not going to be an attempt to prove or disprove psychic prophecy. What you are about to hear is an investigation, pulled together from parish registers, court documents, preserved notebooks, and letters that have sat unread for more than a century. It is the story of one family in one small town, and of one boy trying to make sense, in the only way he knew how, of what was happening, or what he believed was going to happen, to his sister. And somewhere along the way, the line between foresight and fear, between medicine and imagination, becomes very hard to draw. In 1881, Millfield, Massachusetts was hardly more than a dot on county maps. It sat along a bend in the river, its cluster of houses and shops anchored by a brick textile mill that had been built 20 years before. Census returns from 1880 list its population at just under 3,000. Most of those names belong to farmers, mill workers, tradesmen, their wives, and their children. There is a single physician listed in that census for Millfield proper, a man named Josiah Cole, age 52. There is a second doctor a few miles out, across the town line, but many of the people in Millfield saw a younger man who practiced out of his own home on Elm Street. His name was Matthew Reed.
The census describes him in the terse categories of the time. Reed, Matthew, age 41. Occupation, physician and surgeon. Birthplace, England. Below his name is Reed Eliza, age 36, keeping house. Under them are 2 children, Thomas, son, age 11, at school, and Anna M., daughter, age 8, at school. A separate column for children born, children living appears only in later censuses. To find out that the Reeds had lost a younger child years before, an infant named Samuel, you have to look in the family Bible and the church burial register. Their house, according to an 1880s insurance survey, was a modest 2-story structure on a small lot. The front room doubled as a waiting area. Behind it, what was once a dining room had been fitted with shelves for medical books and a locked cabinet for instruments. At the very back, looking out toward a narrow yard, there was a small room that Matthew sometimes used as an improvised surgery. On weekdays, Thomas would walk uphill to the Millfield Grammar School, a 1-room schoolhouse that took children through their early teens. Surviving school copybooks and teachers' reports paint him as a boy who was bright, restless, and always drawing. In the margins of his arithmetic work, tiny sketches curl: a steam engine with smoke billowing, a horse with its legs bent at unlikely angles, the outline of a man holding his arm. A term report in 1880 from his teacher, a Miss Lydia Pike, includes the comment,
Thomas shows unusual talent in drawing, but dwells overmuch on scenes of injury, easily distracted by his own imaginings. That tendency to put on paper whatever had captured his attention, whether it was a locomotive or a cut finger, would later become central to how people told his story. If you step away from the schoolhouse and look toward Elm Street, you can imagine, with the help of letters and county records, what the Reed household must have been like that winter. A doctor on call at all hours. A mother trying to keep the home running between knocks at the front door. 2 children who had to learn early that their father's work involved pain and sometimes death. The Reed family papers arrived at the Hampshire County Historical Society in 1954 in an old wooden box carried in by a gray-haired woman who introduced herself as a distant cousin. She left the box and a brief letter. "These were in my aunt's attic. They belonged to Dr. Reed's people. Perhaps you can make some use of them." Archivists did what archivists do. They unfolded the letters, flattened them, and put them in labeled folders. They cataloged Matthew's medical ledgers, his tiny, dense handwriting recording house calls and fees. They noted the family Bible with its pages of births and deaths. They set aside a small cloth-bound book with T. Reed, February 1881, written inside the front cover, in a child's hand. Under description, someone typed, "Sketchbook." For more than 60 years, no one looked at it closely. In 2017, a researcher named Laura Nesbitt came to the Society with a different kind of question. Laura is an art historian by training, with a particular interest in the drawings and paintings of children in the 19th century. She was in the middle of a project on how children depicted illness and injury in that period. When she saw Sketchbook, 1881, in the Reed collection listing, she asked to see it. At first, it was what she expected. The early pages held pencil drawings of what was clearly the Reed home, the outline of the school, boxy horses. There were clumsy but earnest attempts to copy illustrations from books, including a steam train and a map of the world. About halfway through, she turned a page and stopped. The drawing of the opened body was not like the others. It was darker, literally and figuratively. The lines were more deliberate. The labels suggested a child who had been listening very carefully to adult words. At the top of that page, in larger script than on any other date in the book, Thomas had written, "March 3rd, 1881. In the bottom corner was the caption, "Annie, after." There are a few ways a historian can respond in that moment to a discovery that seems to bend the rules. One is to step back, assume that there has been a mistake, and try to find it. Laura did exactly that. She checked the other dated pages in the sketchbook. Several had small dates penciled in near the top. February 14th, above a sled. February 22nd, next to a crude American flag. March 1st, beside a winter scene. On most, the handwriting and ink looked the same. On some there were differences that suggested different pens, written on different days, rather than all at once. Laura noticed something else on the inside front cover. Under the name T. Reed and the date February 1881, the boy had drawn a simple calendar grid for March. 7 columns, 5 rows, the numbers 1 through 31 in shaky sequence. On March 1st, he had drawn a tiny sled. On March 2nd, a book. On March 3rd, a small house with a cross above it and the words, "Stayed home, Annie, sick." On March 6th, he had drawn a small, simple cross, all by itself. Whatever else could be said about his sense of time, Thomas was paying attention to dates that month. To know if the dates in the sketchbook matched what official records showed, Laura needed to leave the reading room and call up different kinds of documents. The town's clerk's register for Millfield in 1881 is a large, leather-bound volume stored in the county archives. Under the heading for deaths that year, in neat ink, is an entry, Reed, Anna M., female, age 9, daughter of Matthew and Eliza Reed. Died March 6, 1881, of perforation of the appendix, resulting peritonitis. Residence, Millfield. On a separate pre-printed form, the state death certificate, the same information appears. The certificate bears the signature of the attending physician, Dr. Josiah Cole, and the notation that the death occurred on Sunday, the 6th of March. The date is repeated in other places. In the Reed Family Bible, on a page of family events, Eliza's sloping hand has written, "Our dear Annie fell ill March 3rd, went to the Lord, March 6th, 1881. In the March 10th edition of the Millfield Gazette, the small death notice reads, "Died on Sunday last, Anna M., beloved daughter of Dr. and Mrs. Reed, aged 9 years after a short illness." All of those sources, state, town, family, newspaper, agree. Annie became noticeably ill on March 3rd. She died on March 6th. Her autopsy, which the coroner's report dates to the afternoon of March 7th, happened the next day. On the page in Thomas's sketchbook, he dated his drawing March 3rd.
If that date was correct, then the drawing did not show something he had seen in a room. It showed something he imagined or believed was coming. There are specialists who make it their business to decide whether a date written in ink 140 years ago was written the same day as the drawing around it or added much later. Laura knew she would need one. Dr. Ben Carter is a forensic document examiner. In his regular work, he analyzes disputed wills, doctored checks, and suspicious signatures. When he agreed to look at high-resolution scans of Thomas's sketchbook, he was working at the very edge of what his training usually covers. Still, line is line, and ink is ink, whether they belong to a forged deed or a boy's drawing. He approached the pages as he always does, slowly, methodically. Under magnification, the ink of the date on the autopsy drawing page looked the same as the ink on the lines of the organs themselves. The way the nib had dug into the paper, the small splatters at the ends of strokes, the faint feathering into the fibers, all were consistent. On other pages where Thomas had written Feb 20 or March 1, the ink had aged in the same way, darkened at the edges, cracked slightly along the grain. Importantly, there were no signs of erasure around the 3 in March 3rd. No roughened fibers, no abrasion, none of the microscopic scars that show up when someone scrapes ink away to replace it. The date had not been written over another number. It had not been squeezed into a gap that suggested second thoughts. Carter was cautious with his conclusions. No examination of this kind can tell you to the day when an entry was made, he noted. What I can say is that the date and the drawing appear to have been made with the same pen, the same ink, and with the same pressure, very likely within the same period of time. There is no visible evidence that the date was added significantly later than the drawing itself. If the dating on the paper seemed to hold, the next place to look was not the page, but the house where all of this took place. The Reed home on Elm Street no longer stands. A photograph from around 1900 shows a modest, boxy house with a simple porch. A 1902 insurance map,
drawn when Millfield was surveyed for fire risk, provides more detail. The front room, labeled office, opened directly off the street. Behind it was a parlor, and behind that a small bedroom marked sick room. Off to the side, behind the office, was a narrow space that the map labels simply as room. In a letter Matthew wrote to his brother in England in 1879, he describes his practice. I have fitted up the little room at the back of the surgery for those occasions when a small operation must be done under my own roof. I do not like to bring such work into the family spaces, but the necessity sometimes presses. The word surgery here refers not to a modern hospital wing, but to his consulting space. Annie's final illness, if we trust the family Bible and Eliza's letter to her sister, began in that house on March 3rd. Eliza's letter, dated March 4th, was written in a neat, controlled hand. She wrote, "Our Annie preclains of a sharp pain low in her right side. She was so lively only days ago, and now she lies in bed and cries if she must move. Matthew thinks it a common colic, but I see worry in his face. He has asked Dr. Cole to come tomorrow if there is no improvement." Later recollections from neighbors, recorded in the 1930s by a local history project, speak of little Annie with the curls, who took sick in the first week of March and never left the bed again. The boy's position in all of this is easier to glimpse in fragments than in long, clear paragraphs. A line in Eliza's letter mentions that poor Tom will not leave her door, though we send him down for his meals. In a reply from Eliza's sister after the funeral, she asks, "How is the boy? You wrote that he spoke strange things of seeing what was done to her." Before Annie's illness, Matthew had sometimes taken Thomas along on house calls, in limited ways. A letter from 1879 jokes that young Tom held the lantern better than my paid assistant, though it also admits that the boy went pale at the sight of a deep cut and had to sit down. From Thomas's own hand, the sketchbook provides a kind of running commentary on his obsessions. Here, a man with a broken arm in a sling. There, a dog with a line of small crosses along its side, labeled stitches. On one page, a drawing copied from his school science primer shows a cross-section of a torso with lungs and heart and a faint suggestion of intestines. That printed illustration did not include an appendix. What is not in those earlier pages is as striking as what is. Nowhere does he draw an opened body on a cable. Nowhere does he label a relative by name. That changes on the March 3rd page. On its own, a child's grim drawing could be explained away as imagination, curiosity, or the influence of a book. It is when you set that page alongside the coroner's inquest file that the picture becomes harder to flatten. The inquest was standard procedure. While there was no suspicion of foul play, the combination of a sudden death, attempted medical intervention at home, and a physician's own child as the deceased triggered a formal review. The coroner's handwritten notes, stored for decades in the county clerk's office, give times, names, and a plain description of what Dr. Cole did when he opened Annie's abdomen on March 7th. He noted the length and position of the incision. He described the vermiform appendix as much distended, red, and perforated. He testified that he had removed the bad piece and shown it to Dr. Reed as the likely source of the infection. In his oral testimony before the small panel, summarized in the file, he's recorded as saying, "We took out the bad piece, but it was too late. The poison was already through her." The phrase "bad piece" appears under Pomus's misspelling on his drawing. Together, these documents suggest that the child had access, one way or another, to specific information that was not widely shared with the public at the time. In 1881, the appendix was only starting to be recognized as a distinct structure with a distinct disease. The word itself had not yet entered popular speech. Most rural families thought in terms of inflammation of the bowels, or peritonitis, or simply fever. To fill in that gap, Laura turned to someone who knows the history of medicine. Dr. Maria Ellenson, a historian at a nearby university, has spent years studying rural practice in New England in the late 19th century. When Laura showed her the documents, including copies of the drawing, the death record, and the inquest report, she reacted first as a historian and then as a mother. From the historian's perspective, she noted that in 1881, the first successful appendectomies had been performed in Europe, but had not yet become routine in American small towns. She explained, a doctor like Reed or Cole might well have read about the appendix in medical journals. They might use the term among themselves. With families, they would likely talk about a small bit of bowel that burst or a little worm that went bad. From the parental perspective, she said, it is not surprising that a doctor's child in a small house overheard more of that talk than anyone intended. So one way of understanding the drawing is to see it as the product of overheard phrases, filtered through fear, and turned into a picture. But that explanation still has to contend with the date. If Thomas drew Annie after on March 3rd, he was putting on paper what he thought would happen before it did. If he drew it later and dated it backwards, that's a different kind of story. One about memory, guilt, or perhaps even a wish to make sense of what had already occurred. To sort that out, Laura and the local archivist, Mark Ellis, went looking in another place where children leave durable traces: school records.
The 1880s, she recalled. There was that doctor's boy, Tommy Reed, who drew such awful things. Folks said he drew his little sister laid open before the doctors ever touched her. And some said he had the sight, and others that he was just overset in his mind. Her memory, 50-plus years after the fact, is imprecise, but shows that the story lingered. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, spiritualist magazines that collected accounts of premonitions and second sight occasionally printed short, anonymous items that looked suspiciously like distorted versions of what happened in Millfield. One 1909 pamphlet mentions a New England physician's son who sketched his sister's post-mortem upon the very day she first took to bed, though it places the event in Maine and gets the names wrong. Those retellings, embroidered and relocated, show how quickly an ambiguous event can be recruited into someone else's cause. If we step away from the question of psychic foresight for a moment and instead follow the people involved beyond 1881, a quieter and in some ways more moving picture emerges. After Annie's death, Matthew Reed continued to practice medicine in Millfield for a time. His ledgers show a steady decline in surgical procedures, where in the late 1870s he had noted several amputations and lanced abscesses. By the mid-1880s, most entries were for consultations, fevers, and childbirths, with serious operations referred to Dr. Cole or to a hospital in the nearest city. In a letter to his brother dated 1882, he wrote, "In since Annie, I find that my hand hesitates more than it ought when the knife is needed. Perhaps another man, less burdened by domestic misfortune, would better serve such cases." His brother replied with platitudes about providence and the limits of human skill. By 1885, city directories list Matthew not as physician, but as clerk, suggesting that he had taken a position in a druggist shop or another less demanding post. He died in 1904. His obituary in the Gazette is short and formal, mentioning only that he had for many years served the town as a physician. Thomas did not stay. Surviving fragments of the 1890 census and Boston city directories indicate that he left Millfield in his early 20s, taking work first as an apprentice in a lithography firm. By the mid-1990s, medical journals published in Boston and New York carry small credits in their fine print. Illustrations by T.M. Reed. The images he produced as a professional are considered, detailed, and stripped of personal narrative. A plate illustrating an article on hernia repair, a diagram of abdominal blood vessels, a cross-section of a kidney. His drawing of an open torso in a surgical text from 1997 bears a distant resemblance to the crude image in the sketchbook from 1881, but the proportions are correct, the organs shaded, the labels in a confident adult hand. What began as a boy's fearful sketch had, in some sense, become his life's work. One of the last pieces of the puzzle to surface was a letter he wrote in 1911 to a former Millfield schoolmate, James Pike, the younger brother of his old teacher. The letter turned up in a family trunk donated to the Historical Society long after Laura had finished her first study of the case. In that letter, Thomas, by then in his 40s, wrote, "You will recall those days when my poor sister lay abed, and I, foolish boy, spoke of seeing her opened up. My father never forgave himself, nor I myself, for how I tried to master death by tracing its lines. It has been my profession, for better or worse, ever since. If there was any vision in those days, it was only this, that what we refuse to look at will still govern us. I, at least, chose to look." He attributed his early drawing to night visions fed by overheard talk, a glimpse of steel, and dread working on a vibrant fancy. Psychologists who study grief in children say that this sounds exactly like what they see in many families whose stories never make it into archives. When death or serious illness enters a home, children are rarely given full, frank explanations. They pick up on tone more than on words. They read the body language of adults in doorways. They see doors closed that are usually open. They sometimes, as Thomas did, get a half-second's glimpse of tools or blood or an altered body before someone hustles them away. Their minds fill in the rest. Dr. Karen Schultz, a clinical psychologist who has worked with bereaved children for 3 decades, spoke to Laura about the Reed case. She said, "People hear about this story and jump straight to prophecy, but what strikes me is how much it looks like a classic attempt at mastery. A boy hears that there is a bad piece inside his sister. He senses that the adults are planning something they won't name. He dreams, maybe more than once, about what that something looks like. Then he draws it. That act of drawing is his way of saying, if I can see it, maybe I can control it." From that perspective, the date on the drawing becomes less about magic and more about timing, the moment when Thomas could no longer keep his horror in his head and had to put it onto paper. Whether he did that on the evening of March 3rd, or the afternoon of the 4th, or after church on the 6th, matters less to the psychology than the simple fact that he did it while the crisis was still unfolding, and not as a tidy recollection weeks or months later. What remains hard to explain away entirely is the close match between his crude sketch and the language of the autopsy report. Rational accounts, however, do not require a boy to have detailed anatomical knowledge to produce something disturbingly similar. A child's drawing of guts can look close enough to intestines to impress us in hindsight. A circle and an arrow next to a generic blob can stand in retroactively for a surgeon's note about a vermiform appendix. The mind is good at drawing connections after the fact. When the Hampshire County Historical Society decided to mount a small exhibit around the Reed materials, they faced a choice. They could lean into the uncanny, bill it as the boy who drew his sister's autopsy before it happened, and trust that curiosity would bring people through the doors. Or they could take a more cautious path. In the end, they called the exhibit Drawing Annie, a Family, a Doctor, and a Boy's Imagination in 1881. In a simple glass case, they placed the sketchbook open to the March 3rd page. Next to it lay a facsimile of the death certificate and a typed excerpt from the coroner's report, the lines about the incision and the bad piece highlighted. Below those was Miss Pike's letter to the Reeds, her cramped script expressing concern. On a nearby panel, visitors could read a short summary of Victorian medical practice and how children often tried to process illness and loss through images. The exhibit did not answer the question of prophecy. It did not have to. It asked visitors instead to think about what it means for a child to be present at the edge of adult knowledge, listening to the language of danger, and then to imagine what that child might do to make sense of it. Among the comment cards collected at the end of the small display, many came from older adults. Some wrote about grandchildren who had made strange comments before a relative died, remarks that only felt meaningful afterwards. Others remembered their own childhood drawings during times when a parent or a sibling was sick. One visitor wrote, "Seeing this makes me think less about whether the boy knew the future and more about how alone he must have felt and how much of that fear got trapped on this page." There is a temptation, when we stumble on a story like this in the archives, to turn it into a kind of evidence for whatever we already believe. For some, it becomes a proof of second sight, or the thinness between the veil of life and death. For others, it is a textbook case of confirmation bias, of how humans line up details after the fact to make a pattern. What the paper itself resists is a simple verdict. The ink has dried. The fibers have aged. The date is in the corner. The caption at the bottom names a girl who was real, who fell sick, and who died in a small town in Massachusetts in March of 1881. What is certain is this: a 12-year-old boy, in a house where his father and another doctor were talking in low voices about a little worm piece that could burst inside his sister, lay abed and saw something in his mind that scared him enough to put it on paper. He drew lines where he thought a knife might go. He labeled the parts he had heard about. He tried with crayons and ink to get ahead of what felt unstoppable. His life after that moment suggests that in some way he never stopped trying. He turned that fearful curiosity into a career, making clear, controlled images of the human body for medical textbooks. He wrote decades later that if there had been any vision in his childhood, it was the realization that what we refuse to look at will still govern us. Every autopsy asks what happened inside a body in the hours and days before it went still. We cut, we open, we peer in, because we cannot bear not to know. Thomas Reed's drawing, dated or misdated as it may be, is its own kind of autopsy. Not of his sister's abdomen, though it takes that form, but of his own fear. Whether he glimpsed the future in some extraordinary way or simply connected what was already in front of him faster and more vividly than the adults around him, we cannot say with certainty. What we can say is that, confronted with the approach of loss, he reached for the only tool within his grasp and did the one thing that made sense to him. He drew the lines first, before the knife did. And that is perhaps the most unsettling part of all. Not that a boy might have seen the shape of what was coming, but that, standing on the threshold of something he could not change, he chose to meet it with ink and paper, because he had nothing else to hold on to.